Hello, I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about rabies and the policy at Hale Veterinary Clinic with regard to rabies immunization. Rabies is a disease caused by a virus that affects mammals, including humans. It can be spread in the saliva from an infected animal, either through a bite wound that breaks the skin, or from infected saliva getting into an open sore, cut, or wound, or infected saliva getting into the nose, mouth, or eyes of a non-infected individual. It's also possible that ingestion of the brain or spinal tissue of an infected animal could result in spread of rabies. In Ontario, rabies is most common in foxes, skunks, raccoons, and bats, which are all animals that live in high population density both in rural and in urban areas. So there's really no part of Ontario that doesn't have a high concentration of these animals. Very important thing to know about rabies is that once an animal, whether it's a human or a domestic pet or a wild animal, once an animal starts to show signs of rabies infection, it is virtually 100% fatal. There's virtually no chance that that animal is going to recover, and there's no medical intervention that can prevent them from dying. If an animal is being exposed to rabies and that exposure is known about very soon after it happened, then post-exposure immunization can prevent the development of signs. But once signs develop, it is a death sentence. Now, apparently animals can shed the virus in their saliva as much as 10 days before showing clinical signs. So you may have been in contact with an animal that is shedding the virus and be unaware of it because the animal is not yet showing clinical signs. The typical incubation period, time from being exposed to the virus to showing clinical signs, is 2 weeks, but can be up to several months. So again, it can be hard to be certain that if you've been in contact with a rabid animal, it can be hard for you to know that and to access medical intervention in a timely manner to get that post-exposure vaccination to prevent you from becoming rabid and dying of the disease. We hear from some owners that they don't feel that their animal requires vaccination against rabies because it's a strictly indoor animal, a cat or a dog that lives on the 20th floor of an apartment and only goes to the bathroom on a pee pad in the apartment or whatever, or that the dog is never out of their control, is always on a leash when outside, so really is not at risk of contracting rabies. But unfortunately, because of the vectors, the common vectors in Ontario, and their proximity to humans and to our companion animals, that really is not protection enough. Skunks, foxes, raccoons, they live in our ravines, they live in our backyards, they live under our garden sheds, they live in our parks. So anywhere you go, there is the risk that one of these rabid animals may come in contact with your pet, even if it's on a leash. Just letting your dog out in the backyard, it's certainly at risk of coming in contact with a skunk or a raccoon at night. And even for indoor animals, bats can get inside our houses. They can get in through the tiniest of cracks. Many years ago, we'd been away for a week, and when we came home, I was surprised to find a dead bat in the waste paper basket in my home office. I thought it odd that it went into the waste paper basket to die, but fortunately that's where it was, so I was able to dispose of it without touching it. If I'd been thinking, I probably ought to have sent it for testing, but we were away for a week. All our animals were with us that week. They were all vaccinated against rabies, so I didn't feel that that animal posed any risk to us. But the point is that if we'd been indoors with our animals and our animals had not been vaccinated and that bat had tested positive for rabies, then all of our animals would have been on a 3-month quarantine and would have been at risk of contracting rabies and spreading it to any humans into which or with whom they had contact. In 2017, and the following are stories I just found on a very quick internet search of CBC and other news sources. In 2017, there was a pet owner noticed their dog had something in its mouth. It turned out to be a dead bat. This was in Guelph. When the bat was taken to the veterinarian, it was sent for testing, tested positive for rabies. The dog had been vaccinated prior, so was fortunately not a huge risk, but was put under a 3-month quarantine, which would be very stressful for the dog and very stressful for the owners, wondering, is their animal going to come down with signs? Are they going to be in need of post-exposure vaccination? In 2018, a rabid bat flew into the swimming area at Lake Bellwood, just outside of Fergus. And in 2019, in the summer of 2019, out in British Columbia in Tofino, out on Vancouver Island, a young man was out for a walk, and in the middle of the day, a bat apparently flew into and bumped into his hand. He didn't see any wound at the time, didn't think there was anything requiring medical intervention. 6 weeks later, that young man started to develop signs of rabies, and he died. And it was determined that the bat was rabid, and the small wound created when the bat bumped into his hand was sufficient to infect him, and he didn't seek post-exposure vaccination, and he died. So this is a disease with which we do not trifle. And so this is why I have a very firm policy at Hale Veterinary Clinic that for us to accept a patient or to accept a pet as a patient, since I'm working in the mouth, I'm working in the saliva, I am at great risk of exposure to our patient's saliva, that I need to know that that animal has been vaccinated against rabies and is current on its protection. I'm going to now read from the relevant legislation. I'll be paraphrasing a little bit, but this is from the Health Protection and Promotion Act. You can find the full text at www.ontario.ca/laws/regulation/900567. And the legislation reads in part, every owner or person having the care or custody of a cat, dog, or ferret 3 months of age or over shall ensure that the dog, cat, or ferret is immunized against rabies. Every owner or person having the care or custody of an animal that is required to be immunized against rabies shall ensure that the animal is re-immunized against rabies by the date specified in the certificate of immunization issued with respect to that animal. Immunization shall be carried out by a veterinarian registered under the Veterinarians Act and by inoculation with a rabies vaccine that is licensed for use in Canada and that is administered in accordance with the instructions of the manufacturer who produced the vaccine. Then there's a note that a certificate of immunization signed by the veterinarian who did the immunization will be provided to the owner or the person who has care of the animal, and this certificate will list the name and address and description of the animal, microchip number, and so forth. It will also indicate what vaccine was used, what date it was given, and when it needs to be when that animal needs to be re-immunized. Now, so that's the law that if you have a dog, a cat, or a ferret 3 months of age or older in Ontario, by law, that animal must be immunized against rabies with a licensed vaccine given by a licensed veterinarian. Now, the law does acknowledge that there are some animals that may have serious medical conditions that preclude them being vaccinated against rabies. But to be clear, this law is not for the protection of the animals, it's for the protection of human public health. So the law doesn't really care if your animal might have an adverse reaction to the vaccine. The law cares more that your animal not be a source of rabies infection for humans. So the protection of the animal, your dog, your cat, their protection isn't really the focus of this legislation. The legislation is there to protect public human health. But there is provision for animals that may have serious medical conditions. And that section reads as follows. The owner or person having the care or custody of an animal that has a medical condition precluding the safe immunization or re-immunization of the animal against rabies is exempt from the requirement of this regulation if a statement of exemption is issued by a veterinarian with respect to the animal that contains the information in subsection, so all the animal's name and identification and microchip number and all that sort of thing, that the animal is controlled in such a manner as to preclude it being exposed to rabies. as we've already discussed, it's very easy for an animal in Ontario to have potential exposure to rabies. All you need to do is let your dog go out in the backyard, and it potentially could come in contact with a skunk, a fox, or a raccoon. Or for an animal that's strictly indoors, bats can get indoors. So there's really no way to completely preclude your animal from being at risk of coming in contact with a rabid animal. But if a veterinarian is willing to sign a certificate and the animal is controlled in such a manner as to preclude it ever being exposed to rabies, then a certificate of exemption can be issued by that veterinarian that has all of the same information as the vaccine certificate, the name and address and so forth, breed, sex, age, color, markings, microchip number, size, and so forth. Also the date for each previous rabies immunization and any relevant adverse effects related to the immunization documented in the medical record of the animal, the medical condition precluding safe immunization or re-immunization, as the case may be, the duration of the exemption for the requirement of immunization. So it's not a lifelong exemption. Full name and contact information of the veterinarian who issued the exemption, and the date of the statement of exemption. An owner or person referred to in subsection 1 continues to be exempt from the requirements of this regulation for the duration of the exemption period in the statement of exemption. So an exemption will have an expiry date, and at the end of that, the animal either must be revaccinated or a new exemption certificate must be issued. The owner or person having care or custody of an animal that is subject to the rabies immunization requirements shall provide a copy of certificate of immunization or a statement of exemption for that animal to a medical officer of health or public health inspector upon request. So you've got to have one or the other. And if you don't have either, then you're in contravention of this law. The map on the screen now is put out by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and it indicates where positive tests have been found in wildlife in Ontario over the last several years. The little bar graph shows that there's quite a spike in 2016, and through the use of oral vaccination, baits dropped in rural or in ravines and so on, where skunks and foxes and raccoons can ingest this oral vaccination. The numbers have been coming down over the years since 2016 spike. We can still see that there's quite a concentration of positive tests in the area around Hamilton of the raccoon strain, and then a scattering of positive tests of the fox strain to the north and west. And we get a map like this about every month. I tend to get it from the website of the Ontario Association of Veterinary Technicians, the OAVT website or Facebook page. They always post this map when it comes out each month, showing the latest statistics on rabies surveillance in wildlife in Ontario. It just shows that, yeah, this is something that is out there in the wildlife in southern Ontario. So when I'm working in a patient's mouth, even just doing a clinical examination on a first visit consultation, I'm exposed to their saliva. Since an animal can be shedding the virus 10 days prior to showing clinical signs, it is possible that I might examine an animal, be exposed to infected saliva, and become infected with the virus myself. By the time that animal's showing clinical signs, and it's realized that it's showing signs of rabies, and somebody gets in touch with me to say, oh, by the way, you were exposed to an animal that is now showing clinical signs of rabies. Since the incubation period can be as short as 14 days, by the time I get word I've been exposed, I may already be showing clinical signs. And in that case, I will die. Now, fortunately, I've been vaccinated against rabies, and I have my vaccination boosted periodically. So chances are I would be fine. But I don't want to be taking that chance. So with all of that in mind, we have a pretty firm policy at Hale Veterinary Clinic that in order for us to consider taking a pet as a patient, we must see a valid and current certificate of vaccination against rabies. There are several reasons for this, as we've discussed. One, it's the law in Ontario. 2, I don't want your pet dying of rabies. 3, I don't want you or anybody you know dying of rabies. And 4, I don't want myself or any of my staff dying of rabies. Now, in those rare instances where there is a true, legitimate medical reason for an exemption, I must see a certificate of exemption signed by your primary care veterinarian outlining the medical reasons why your animal is not current on its vaccines against rabies. Unfortunately, I will not accept that your breeder warned you against vaccinations against rabies or that you may be vaccine hesitant. This is not something that's open to debate. I must have a valid certificate of vaccination or a valid and current certificate of exemption signed by your primary care veterinarian. Otherwise, I cannot accept your pet as a patient at Hale Veterinary Clinic. I hope this makes sense to you. Thank you. Goodbye.